This is a story about how God works not through spectacular miracles, but through ordinary circumstances orchestrated with extraordinary precision. It's about faithfulness maintained in the mundane realities of daily life, about courage found in unexpected people at crucial moments, about the way that choices made years earlier create the conditions for deliverance in the present. Consider all the pieces that had to be in place for this rescue to occur. Esther had to become queen, chosen from among many candidates, winning the king's favor at just the right time. This happened years before Haman was elevated to power, years before the threat to the Jewish people emerged. Yet when the crisis came, there was someone in the royal palace who was both Jewish and had the king's ear. Mordecai had to be positioned at the king's gate, faithful in his duties, observant enough to notice a conspiracy, loyal enough to report it. This happened years before it would matter, before anyone knew that this act of loyalty would become the hinge on which everything would turn. The king's sleepless night had to occur on exactly the right night after Haman had set up the poll and was planning to request Mordecai's execution. But before he actually made that request, one night earlier or later, and everything would have unfolded differently, the passage read from the Chronicles during that sleepless night had to be the one about Mordecai saving the king's life. The court records were extensive, covering years of events, but that particular night, the reader came to that particular passage, reminding the king of a debt never paid. Haman had to arrive at the palace just when the king was wondering how to honor Mordecai. His timing meant to be opportune for requesting his enemy's death, instead became the mechanism for his enemy's exaltation. Esther had to win the king's favor again when she approached uninvited. Survive the initial risk and then navigate the complex task of exposing Haman without seeming to criticize the king who had approved Haman's plan. None of these individually is impossible or even particularly unlikely. Kings do have sleepless nights. Court records do get read. Officials do expose conspiracies. Queens do approach their husbands with requests. But all of them together timed precisely, arranged perfectly. Each piece fitting into the larger pattern that begins to look less like coincidence and more like careful orchestration. And yet God's name is never mentioned in the entire account. Not once. The book of Esther is unique in biblical literature for this omission. There are no prayers recorded, no prophets delivering messages, no miraculous interventions that force acknowledgement of divine presence. Everything happens through human choices and natural circumstances. You could read the story and conclude it was simply good luck, clever strategy, and fortunate timing. But the Jewish people who celebrate Purim every year understand it differently. They see in the story a pattern of providence working quietly behind the scenes, arranging circumstances, positioning people, timing events with precision, while allowing human beings to make real choices with real consequences. This is not determinism that removes human agency, but rather divine sovereignty working through human faithfulness, turning choices made in ordinary days into pivotal moments that change history. Mordecai's vigil was not a single night, but a lifetime. It was years of showing up at the king's gate, performing his duties faithfully, even when no one noticed. It was the choice to report the assassination plot when remaining silent would have been safer. It was the refusal to bow to Haman, even when everyone around him was bowing, even when maintaining that principle cost him personally. It was the courage to challenge Esther, to help her see her moment of destiny, to believe that deliverance would come, even if she chose not to be part of it. And Esther's courage was born in preparation. 3 days of fasting before approaching the king, community support surrounding her, spiritual and emotional strengthening before stepping into danger. Her courage was also born in wisdom, the careful timing of her revelations, the building of suspense, the strategic use of banquets to create the right context for her accusation. She was not reckless but thoughtful, not impulsive but prepared. The lesson is profound and applicable across time and culture. God often works through unseen faithfulness rather than public heroics. He positions people in advance, sometimes years before they're needed. He prepares hearts through consistent obedience in small things. He turns sleepless nights into moments of revelation. He takes plots meant for destruction and transforms them into platforms for deliverance. You may be living your own vigil right now, showing up day after day at your equivalent of the King's Gate, to doing what is right even when no one notices, serving faithfully in ordinary circumstances that seem to have no particular significance. You may be maintaining integrity in small decisions, standing firm on principles that cost you personally, preparing yourself spiritually and emotionally for challenges you can't yet see coming. You may wonder if it matters. You may question whether your faithfulness makes any difference in a world that often rewards compromise and celebrates those who make noise over those who remain steady. You may feel invisible, unrecognized, stuck in ordinary routines while others seem to be doing dramatic and important things. But Marai's story whispers a different truth. Your quiet faithfulness is seen. Your integrity matters. One, your daily choices are creating conditions for moments of impact you cannot yet imagine. The courage you develop now in small things is preparing you for larger challenges ahead. The relationships you're building, the reputation you're earning, the spiritual disciplines you're maintaining, all of it may be positioning you for a moment when everything will depend on whether you're ready. Providence often works in shadows. It moves through ordinary moments that only later reveal their significance. It positions people long before crisis arrives. It transforms intended destruction into unexpected deliverance. And years later, looking back, the pattern becomes clear. Not luck, not coincidence, but the careful orchestration of a God who never abandons his people. Even when his name goes unspoken, even when his presence feels invisible, rest in that truth. Trust in that reality. Continue your vigil with faithfulness, knowing that ordinary obedience often matters more than extraordinary gestures. That daily integrity builds the foundation for moments of courage. That God is working through your life in ways you may not see until much later. The story of Purim is still celebrated by Jewish communities around the world thousands of years after these events occurred. Children dress up in costumes. Families gather for festive meals. The book of Esther is read aloud with a congregation making noise whenever Haman's name is mentioned and cheering when Morai and Esther are named. It is a celebration of reversal, of deliverance, of the defeat of those who seek to destroy God's people. But it is also a reminder that faithfulness in ordinary days creates the conditions for extraordinary outcomes. That courage is often quiet before it becomes visible. That God's purposes unfold in ways we cannot always see in the moment, but become undeniable when viewed from the perspective of time. Marai's legacy is captured in the final description. He worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. Not that he achieved great fame, not that he accumulated wealth or power for himself, not that he took revenge on all his enemies. His legacy was simpler and more profound. He used his position to benefit others. He advocated for the vulnerable. He served the common good of his community. May we all leave such a legacy, not of power grasped for ourselves, but of faithfulness sustained for others. Not of glory claimed in our own names, but of God's purposes fulfilled through lives lived with quiet, unshakable courage. Not of dramatic gestures that fade from memory, but of steady service that shapes history in ways we may never fully know. The night that saved a nation was actually thousands of ordinary days of faithfulness that created the conditions for that night to matter. The vigil that made deliverance possible was not a moment, but a lifestyle. Not an event, but a character formed over years of choosing integrity over convenience, truth over comfort, faithfulness over safety. And that is the invitation extended to us to live our vigils faithfully trusting that God is positioning us even when we cannot see the purpose preparing us, even when we don't understand the plan. orchestrating circumstances even when everything seems ordinary or even discouraging. For such a time as this, that phrase has become famous, a call to recognize moments of destiny. But the profound truth is that every time is such a time. Every ordinary day is preparing us for extraordinary moments. Every small choice is building the foundation for larger impacts. Live faithfully in the ordinary. Stand firm on principle even when it costs you. Maintain integrity in small things. Prepare yourself spiritually and emotionally. Build relationships with care. Serve your community faithfully. And trust that God is weaving all of it together into something far more significant than you can see in the moment. That is the lesson of Marai's vigil. That is the wisdom of Esther's courage. That is the testimony of a night that saved a nation because faithful people were ready when the moment came. May we all be ready for our moments. May we all maintain our vigils with faithfulness. And may we all trust that in the shadows where we cannot see, providence is at work, arranging circumstances, positioning people, preparing deliverance for such a time as this. The kingdom of Judah, approximately 850 years before the Common Era, a small nation carved into the hills and valleys of the ancient Near East, surrounded by hostile powers, trade routes, and the endless political machinations of empires. This was not a time of peace. This was not an era when small kingdoms survived by accident. Survival required cunning, strength, military prowess, and often brutal compromise. But Judah had something different. They had Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat was not like the kings who came before him, nor like those who had come after. He ascended to the throne as a young man, inheriting a kingdom still recovering from the spiritual chaos of previous generations. His father Asa had begun reforms, tearing down pagan altars and driving out those who practiced divination and idol worship. But Jehoshaphat took it further, much further. He understood something fundamental. A kingdom's strength was not measured only in chariots and fortified cities, but in the spiritual foundation of its people. So he did something almost unheard of in the ancient world. He sent teachers throughout the land, not tax collectors, not military recruiters, teachers. These men carried scrolls containing the law, the ancient instructions given to Moses centuries before. They traveled from town to town, went village to village, gathering people in the squares and teaching them. They explained the commandments, the festivals, the stories of deliverance. They reminded the people of who they were and whose they were. Jehoshaphat strengthened the cities. He built fortifications, yes, but he also established garrisons, not just for defense, but to maintain order and justice. He appointed judges throughout Judah, instructing them with words that would echo through history. Consider carefully what you do, because you are not judging for man, but for the Lord, who is with you whenever you give a verdict. Now let the fear of the Lord be upon you. Judge carefully, for with the Lord our God, there is no injustice or partiality or bribery. This was revolutionary. In a world where justice could be bought, and where the powerful crush the weak without consequence, Jehoshaphat was building something different. A kingdom where the law applied to everyone, where the wealthy could not simply purchase favorable outcomes, where the orphan and widow had the same standing as the merchant and landowner. The kingdom prospered. Trade routes brought wealth. The people experienced a season of peace. Surrounding nations, seeing Judah's growing strength and stability, thought twice before provoking conflict. Some even brought gifts and tribute, preferring alliance to warfare. Jehoshaphat expanded his influence through strategic marriages and alliances. He maintained a standing army, well-trained and well-equipped. Chronicles from that period record that he had commanders and troops numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Soldiers who trained regularly, who understood formation and discipline, who were loyal to their king and their God. For years this was enough. Judah thrived. The people worshiped freely. The harvest were good. Children grew up hearing the old stories, learning the ancient songs, understanding their identity as a chosen people with a unique covenant. But peace, as it always does in this broken world, eventually gave way to storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The threat emerges. The messenger arrived at dawn, his horse lathered with sweat, his face gray with exhaustion and fear. He had ridden through the night from the eastern watchtowers, changing horses at every garrison, pushing himself and his mounts to the breaking point, because the news he carried could not wait, could not be delayed even by an hour. He was brought immediately before the king. "My lord," he said, barely able to catch his breath, "an army is coming, a vast army from beyond the Dead Sea, from Edom. They have already crossed into our territory. They're at Engedi." The room fell silent. Engedi. That was barely a 3-day march from Jerusalem. This was not a border skirmish. This was not a raiding party. This was an invasion force, and it was already well inside Judah's borders. "Who?" Jehoshaphat demanded. "Who marches against us?" "The Moabites, my lord, and the Ammonites, and with them others, people from Mount Seir. The numbers—" The messenger paused, struggling to find words for what he had seen. "My lord, I have never seen so many. They fill the valleys like locusts. Their campfires at night look like a city made of stars. And they are more than we can count." The king's advisors immediately began speaking over one another. Some called for immediate military mobilization. Others suggested sending envoys to negotiate, to buy time. A few mentioned calling on allies, though everyone in the room knew Judah's alliances were political conveniences, not promises written in blood. When the moment of crisis came, they would be alone. Jehoshaphat raised his hand, silencing the room. He stood and walked to the window that overlooked Jerusalem. The city was just beginning to wake. Smoke rose from morning cooking fires. Merchants were setting up their stalls in the markets. Children played in the streets. Normal life continuing in blissful ignorance of the doom marching toward them. The situation was dire. Moab and Ammon were ancient enemies of Israel and Judah, a descendants of Lot who had always harbored resentment toward their relatives who had inherited the promised land. They were fierce warriors, familiar with the desert terrain, masters of ambush and guerrilla warfare. But this was not just those two nations. The coalition included others, expanding the threat exponentially, and they had done something tactically brilliant. They had approached from the east, from the wilderness side where Judah's defenses were weakest. The major fortifications faced north and west toward the traditional threats of Aram and the coastal peoples. The eastern approach, through the rugged terrain near the Dead Sea, had always been considered too difficult for a major military operation. Apparently, the enemy had decided the difficulty was worth the element of surprise. Jehoshaphat's commanders began calculating scenarios. Even with rapid mobilization, they could muster perhaps 50,000 fighting men. Disciplined, yes, well-trained, certainly, but against a force that might number 3 or 4 times that size. The mathematics of warfare were brutally simple. Without a significant tactical advantage, without defensible terrain, without time to prepare proper fortifications, they would be overwhelmed. Some of the younger commanders spoke boldly of Gideon, of how God had given victory to 300 men against thousands, but the older veterans remained silent. They had seen battle. They knew what happened when infantry formations broke. They knew how quickly courage could turn to panic when the line collapsed and enemy soldiers poured through the gaps. The king turned from the window. His face was set, determined, but those closest to him could see something else in his eyes. Not panic exactly, not despair, but a deep, profound recognition of how precarious their situation had become. "Send word to every town and city," he said quietly. "We're calling a fast, the entire nation. Tomorrow, everyone who can travel is to come to Jerusalem. We're going to seek the Lord." Some of the advisors exchanged glances. A fast now, with an enemy army days away? Shouldn't they be marshaling troops, preparing defenses, forging last-minute alliances? But Jehoshaphat was not asking for opinions. This was not a suggestion. This was a royal decree because he understood something his advisors were too practical to see. Some battles cannot be won with swords alone. Some enemies are too powerful for human strength to overcome. And in those moments, you either trust in something greater than yourself or you are crushed beneath the weight of impossible odds. Messengers were dispatched immediately. Riders left Jerusalem in every direction, carrying the king's summons, a fast, a holy assembly. By tomorrow, the city began to transform almost immediately. Word spread through the markets, through the neighborhoods, through the surrounding villages. An army was coming. The king had called for prayer. Families began preparing to travel to Jerusalem. Those already in the city began preparing the squares and courtyards for the multitudes who would arrive. As the sun set that evening, Jehoshaphat stood again at his window. Somewhere to the east, beyond the hills, an enemy force was making camp, confident in their numbers, sharpening their weapons, preparing for the slaughter they anticipated. And in Jerusalem, the people of Judah were preparing something entirely different, the national fast. They came on foot, on donkeys and carts. They came from the northern villages near Bethel and from the southern settlements near Beersheba. They came from the fortified cities and from tiny farming communities that barely appeared on any map. They came as families, as clans, as entire townships moving together along the ancient roads. By midday, Jerusalem was overflowing. The courtyards around the temple filled first, then the adjacent squares, then the streets themselves. People stood shoulder to shoulder, young and old, wealthy and poor, priests and farmers. The normal social hierarchies that structured ancient society seemed to dissolve in the face of shared danger. Parents held children in their arms, explaining in hushed voices what was happening. Elderly men and women who remembered previous wars, previous invasions, sat with somber faces, knowing too well what an overwhelming enemy force could do to a conquered people. Young men who days before might have boasted about their courage and readiness to fight, now stood quiet, the reality of facing a vastly superior force settling heavily on their shoulders. No cooking fires were lit, no meals were prepared. This was a fast, a complete cessation of normal life. Even the markets remained closed. The usual sounds of commerce, of daily activity, were replaced by something else, the sound of prayer. It started quietly, individuals and families praying in small groups. But gradually, like tributaries joining into a river, the prayers began to merge. Voices joined together. Ancient psalms were recited. Songs of deliverance from generations past were sung, the melodies carrying through the streets. A collective cry rising toward heaven. The temple priests moved through the crowds, offering guidance, leading prayers, reminding people of the covenant, of God's past faithfulness. They recounted the great deliverances, the exodus from Egypt, the crossing of the Red Sea, the fall of Jericho, the victory of David over Goliath. Each story was not just history, but a reminder, a testimony that the God they served had done impossible things before. But there was also raw honesty in the prayers. People were afraid. Mothers wept, thinking of what invading armies did to children. Men confessed their doubts, their fear that this time might be different, that this enemy might be too strong. The prayers were not performances. They were the desperate cries of people who knew they were powerless, who had nowhere else to turn. As evening approached, the crowd grew even larger. Those who lived farther away had been traveling since dawn, and they continued arriving throughout the day. The gates of Jerusalem remained open, welcoming everyone. Guards who normally checked credentials and collected tolls simply waved people through. This was not a time for bureaucracy. This was national crisis, and everyone was needed. Jehoshaphat had not yet appeared publicly. He remained in the palace in his private chambers, spending the day in his own prayers and contemplation. His advisors came periodically with updates, reports from scouts about the enemy's movements, estimates of their arrival time. suggestions for military deployment. But the king's focus was elsewhere. He had made his decision about how to face this threat, and it was not primarily a military decision. Yes, the army would be prepared. Yes, defenses would be set. But the real battle, the one that would determine whether Judah survived or perished, would not be fought with bronze and iron. As darkness fell over Jerusalem, torches and lamps were lit throughout the city. The glow could be seen for miles, a city ablaze with light, filled with people who had set aside everything to seek divine intervention. The prayers continued into the night, not with the formal structure of liturgy, but with the raw desperation of people who had nowhere else to go. In the eastern wilderness, the coalition army also made camp for the night, and their scouts had reported that Judah's forces were not deploying to meet them in the field. Instead, the entire population seemed to be gathering in Jerusalem. The enemy commanders laughed at this, retreating to the city. That just made the conquest easier. They would surround Jerusalem, cut off supplies, and wait. The siege might take weeks or months, but the outcome was inevitable. Judah would surrender or starve. But what the enemy commanders did not understand, could not understand, was that Judah was not preparing for a siege. They were preparing for something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with military strategy or defensive fortifications, something that would make the next day one of the most remarkable in the history of warfare. The prayer in the temple. Dawn broke over Jerusalem to find the crowds had not dispersed. Many had spent the entire night in prayer, sustained not by food but by collective urgency. As the sun rose, the priests opened the inner courts of the temple, and the people pressed forward, filling every available space. Then Jehoshaphat appeared. He emerged from the palace wearing not royal regalia, not the ceremonial robes of kingship, but simple garments. He walked through the crowds, acknowledging no one, his eyes fixed ahead on the temple. The people parted to let him through, and a hush fell over the massive assembly. He entered the temple courts and positioned himself before the altar, in the place where priests typically stood to offer sacrifices. But he carried no sacrifice. He brought no offering of grain or livestock. He brought only himself and his words. The crowd pressed close, straining to hear. Those who could not fit in the temple courts filled the surrounding areas, and word of what the king said would be passed back through the crowds, repeated from person to person, until even those at the farthest edges knew what their king was praying. Jehoshaphat raised his hands toward heaven and began to speak. Lord, the God of our ancestors, are you not the God who is in heaven? You rule over all the kingdoms of the nations. Power and might are in your hand, and no one can withstand you. His voice was strong but not arrogant, confident but not presumptuous. He was stating facts, reminding himself and his people of foundational truth. The God they served was not a local deity, not a tribal protector with limited range and power. This was the creator of heaven and earth, the one who had brought their ancestors out of slavery in Egypt, who had given them this land. Our God, did you not drive out the inhabitants of this land before your people Israel and give it forever to the descendants of Abraham your friend? They have lived in it and have built in it a sanctuary for your name. He was recounting history, but it was not dry recitation. It was personal. Abraham your friend, not Abraham the patriarch, not Abraham the founder of the nation, but Abraham your friend, reminding God and himself and everyone listening that their relationship with the divine was not transactional but relational, built on covenant, built on promises made and kept. If calamity comes upon us, whether the sword of judgment or plague or famine, and we will stand in your presence before this temple that bears your name and will cry out to you in our distress, and you will hear us and save us. Now he was moving to the present crisis, building his case. This is what you promised. This is the covenant. We cry out, you save us. This is how it works. This is what we are doing now. His voice grew more intense, more urgent. But now here are men from Ammon, Moab, and Mount Seir whose territory you would not allow Israel to invade when they came from Egypt. So they turned away from them and did not destroy them. See how they are repaying us by coming to drive us out of the possession you gave us as an inheritance. There was anger in his voice now, righteous indignation. We obeyed you. When our ancestors could have conquered these peoples, we held back because you told us to. We showed mercy, and now they repay that mercy with invasion, with attempted genocide. The crowd murmured in agreement. Yes, this was unjust. This was wrong. They had honored God's commands even when it seemed militarily foolish to leave potential enemies unconquered on their borders. And this was how they were repaid. Then Jehoshaphat's voice changed. The anger faded, replaced by something else. Vulnerability, honesty, the raw admission that every person in that crowd was feeling, but most were too proud to say out loud. Our God, will you not judge them? For we have no power to face this vast army that is attacking us. We have no power. 4 words that no king wanted to speak. 4 words that admitted weakness, that confessed inadequacy, that laid bare the truth everyone knew, but no one wanted to acknowledge. We have no power. The trained army, insufficient. The fortifications, inadequate. The strategic position, untenable. The military advisors, with all their experience and tactical knowledge, out of solutions. We have no power. But Jehoshaphat was not finished because admitting powerlessness was not the same as admitting defeat. Confessing human limitation was not the same as accepting destruction. There was one more sentence, one more phrase that would transform everything. We do not know what to do. A pause, the crowd held its breath. But our eyes are on you. Silence. Absolute silence. Thousands of people, and not a sound. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. Our eyes are on you. Not on our army, not on our walls, not on our strategy or our weapons or our desperate last-minute plans. Our eyes are on you. A Jehoshaphat lowered his hands. He stood there before the altar, before the assembled nation, having laid out the situation with brutal honesty, having confessed their complete inability to save themselves, having placed everything, the survival of the nation, the lives of every person in that crowd, in the hands of the God they served. All of Judah stood before the Lord with their wives and children and little ones. They waited because now it was not their turn to act. They had done what they could do. They had fasted. They had prayed. They had confessed. They had trusted. Now they waited to see if trust would be enough. The prophetic response. The silence stretched. 1 minute, 2, 5. People shifted uncomfortably, wondering what would happen next. Some expected the king to continue speaking. Others thought perhaps the high priest would offer additional prayers. But no one spoke. The assembly remained in expectant stillness. Then something unexpected happened. From somewhere in the midst of the crowd, a man began to move forward. His name was Jahaziel, a Levite, a temple musician, a member of the family of Asaph. He was not high-ranking, not a priest, not a political figure, just a worship leader, someone who on a normal day would have been in the background, supporting the formal religious ceremonies. But something had come upon him, the Spirit of the Lord, the ancient texts would later record. He pushed through the crowd, not rudely, but with unmistakable urgency, making his way toward where the king stood. People recognized the signs. This was prophetic utterance, the same phenomenon that had marked the judges, the prophets, the great voices that had spoken divine truth into crucial moments throughout their history. Jahaziel's face had changed. His normal expression was replaced by an intensity, a focus that suggested he was seeing and hearing something beyond the physical realm. He reached the front of the assembly and turned to face the crowd. His voice when he spoke was loud and clear, carrying across the courtyard with unusual power. Listen, King Jehoshaphat and all who live in Judah and Jerusalem. This is what the Lord says to you. The crowd leaned forward. This is what the Lord says. Not I think, not perhaps, not in my opinion. This is what the Lord says. Direct communication, divine revelation, the answer they had been waiting for. Do not be afraid or discouraged because of this vast army. Do not be afraid. The first words, not here as a complex military strategy, not call on your allies, not prepare for a long siege. Do not be afraid, for the battle is not yours, but God's. The battle is not yours. Every military leader in the crowd knew what that meant. They were being told to stand down, to set aside their training, their weapons, their carefully planned defensive positions. The battle is not yours. You're not the primary actors in this conflict, but God's. This is about something larger than national survival. This is about divine reputation. This is about God's covenant faithfulness being put on display before watching nations. The enemy might think they are marching against Judah, but they have actually picked a fight with something far beyond their comprehension. Joshua continued, and now his voice took on additional urgency because he was giving specific instructions. Tomorrow march down against them. They will be climbing up by the pass of Ziz, and you will find them at the end of the gorge in the desert of Gerald. Specific geographic locations. This was not vague spiritual encouragement. This was actionable intelligence. The pass of Ziz was a known route through the wilderness. The desert of Jerel was a specific area. The prophecy included practical details because faith was not divorced from reality. Trust in divine intervention did not mean ignoring geography and terrain. You will not have to fight this battle. The core message repeated for emphasis. You will not have to fight. Not you will fight and be victorious. Not you will fight and I will help you. You will not have to fight. Take up your positions, stand firm and see the deliverance the Lord will give you. Judah and Jerusalem, take up your positions. So they were to march out. They were to deploy as if for battle. This was not passive waiting in the city. Stand firm. Military language. Hold your ground. But see the deliverance. You are spectators in this battle. Witnesses, not warriors. Jahaziel's voice rose to a crescendo, repeating the opening command. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. Go out to face them tomorrow, and the Lord will be with you. Then the prophetic mantle lifted. Jahaziel staggered slightly as if released from a force that had been holding him upright. Others reached out to steady him. He looked around, seeming momentarily disoriented, as if waking from a deep sleep. But the words remained hanging in the air, reverberating in the minds and hearts of everyone who had heard them. Jehoshaphat, still standing before the altar, slowly lowered himself to his knees. Then he bent forward until his face touched the ground. A position of complete humility, complete submission. The king of Judah prostrate in the dirt before God and before the assembled nation. And the people followed. Like a wave spreading across the courtyard, people dropped to their knees, then fell forward, faces to the ground. Thousands upon thousands, an entire nation in worship, responding not with skepticism or doubt, but with gratitude and trust. Then something remarkable happened. The Levites, the temple musicians, the singers, those whose normal role was to lead worship during festivals and ceremonies began to stand. They moved to the front, forming spontaneous choirs, and they began to sing, not somber songs of pleading, not desperate cries for mercy. They sang songs of praise, songs of thanksgiving, songs celebrating victory that had not yet happened, deliverance that existed only as a promise. Their voices rose strong and confident, filling the temple courts, spilling out into the streets, carrying across the city walls into the surrounding countryside. The time for prayer was over. The time for fasting was complete. Now was the time for worship because they had received their answer. And the answer was not a strategy. The answer was a promise. Tomorrow they would march to war. But they would not be marching as warriors preparing for combat. They would be marching as worshipers preparing to witness a miracle, worship before warfare. Morning came too quickly and not quickly enough. The people had spent the night in restless anticipation, some trying to sleep, others too filled with nervous energy to rest. Families held each other, unsure what the next day would bring, but choosing to trust the prophetic word they had received. As dawn light touched the eastern hills, the army began to assemble. But this was not a normal military mobilization. The usual protocols were being violated. The standard formations abandoned because the instructions they had received were anything but standard. Joshat stood before his assembled forces. Behind him, the palace. Before him, thousands of men in various stages of military readiness. Some wore full armor, others carried only simple weapons. All watched their king, waiting for orders. "We march to the desert of Gero," Jehoshaphat announced. His voice was steady, calm, "and we march in faith, trusting not in our own strength, but in the God who has promised deliverance." Then he gave an order that caused visible confusion among the assembled troops. "The singers go first." Silence. The soldiers looked at each other, certain they had misheard. The singers in battle formation, the best troops led. The most experienced, heavily armored warriors took point position. They absorbed the initial enemy contact, held the line while the rest of the force deployed. That was fundamental military doctrine, unchanged for centuries. But Jehoshaphat was not finished. Those appointed to sing to the Lord and to praise him for the splendor of his holiness will go out at the head of the army. The Levites, the temple musicians, those who normally stood in protected positions during any conflict were being told to march in front. Where casualties were highest, where the danger was greatest, they were being told to lead with worship. One of the military commanders stepped forward, choosing his words carefully. "My lord, if the enemy engages us, the singers will be the first to fall. They are not trained for combat. They do not wear armor. If we encounter the coalition forces, they will be slaughtered before the soldiers can even deploy." Jehoshaphat turned to face the commander. His expression was not angry, but it was firm. "The battle is not ours. Those are not my words. Those are the Lord's words spoken through Jehaziel. We were told to take up positions and stand firm. We were told we would not have to fight, so we will do exactly what we were instructed to do." He turned back to the Levites, to the singers who now stood at the front of the assembly, many looking distinctly uncomfortable with their new position. "Sing," the king commanded. "Give praise to the Lord, for his love endures forever." The singers exchanged glances. This was insane. They were marching toward an army that outnumbered them several times over, and they were supposed to sing, not war chants, not battle cries designed to intimidate the enemy and build courage in their own ranks, but worship songs. But Jehoshaphat had given an order, and he was their king. Hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence they began. "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever." The ancient refrain sung at festivals, at celebrations, at moments of thanksgiving, but never at the start of a military campaign, never marching toward battle. "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever." Other voices joined in. Soldiers began singing along. The words were familiar, burned into their memories from childhood, from countless religious observances. The melody was simple, repetitive, easy to maintain even while marching. "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever." The formation began to move. The singers at the front, their voices carrying across the early morning air. Behind them, the soldiers still armed, still ready for combat, but singing. Behind them, support personnel, supplies, medical attendants, and scattered throughout. More singers, more musicians, keeping the song going, preventing it from fading. They marched east toward the wilderness, toward the approaching enemy, toward what every military strategist would have called certain defeat. But they marched, singing. The sun climbed higher, and the terrain grew rougher as they left the cultivated lands around Jerusalem and entered the rocky wilderness. The pass of Ziz, as Jaziel had prophesied, lay ahead. Scouts reported no contact with enemy forces. The coalition army was apparently still advancing, confident, taking their time because they believed Judah was trapped. The singing continued hour after hour. When the Levites grew tired, soldiers picked up the melody. When one group's voices grew, another section of the formation took over. The song never stopped. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. Some soldiers wept as they marched and sang, not from fear, though certainly fear was present, but from something else. A strange sense of rightness, of being exactly where they were supposed to be, doing exactly what they were supposed to do. Even though everything about it contradicted common sense, they were worshiping their way into battle, praising their way toward an enemy who intended to destroy them. And somehow, impossibly, it felt like the only appropriate response. The columns stretched for miles now, a river of humanity flowing through the wilderness, and the sound of their singing echoed off the rocky cliffs, amplified by the terrain, carrying for incredible distances. Somewhere ahead, the enemy would hear them coming. And what would they think? An army that announced its approach with hymns, soldiers who sang about love and faithfulness rather than strength and conquest. The coalition commanders would likely view it as further evidence of Judah's weakness. Psychological warfare perhaps, but ultimately futile. You could not win battles with songs. But Judah was not trying to win a battle. They were making space for God to do what only God could do. And what happened next would become legend told and retold for generations. A story so extraordinary that many would struggle to believe it, except that it was witnessed by thousands and changed the course of nations. The battle that fought itself. The terrain changed as Judah's forces approached the desert of Gerald. The path narrowed, forcing the formation to compress. Rocky outcroppings rose on either side. It was perfect ambush territory, the kind of ground where a smaller force could inflict devastating casualties on a larger one. The scouts had gone ahead, cautious, expecting at any moment to encounter enemy forward elements. They climbed ridges, checked valleys, searched for signs of the coalition army that intelligence suggested should be nearby. Then one scout returned, riding hard, his face not showing fear but confusion. He approached the king's position, slid from his horse, knelt briefly, then stood, struggling to find words for what he had seen. "My lord, the enemy speak," Jehoshaphat commanded. The singing had paused, the entire formation waiting for the scouts' report. "They are destroyed, my lord. The valley ahead. There are bodies everywhere, but not our people? Them, the coalition. They are. They appear to have killed each other." Silence. Then murmuring rippled through the ranks. "Killed each other? How? Why?" "You're certain?" the king asked. "My lord, I went to the ridge overlooking the valley. I saw the camps, the banners, Moabitet, Hammonite, the men from Es, all mixed together and all dead or dying. There is no organized force remaining. Whatever happened, it was catastrophic." Josh closed his eyes briefly, and those near him saw his lips moving in silent prayer. Then he opened his eyes and gave the order. "We advance carefully, prepare for possible survivors or ambush, but we go forward." The formation moved again, now with heightened alertness. Soldiers gripped weapons, scanning the terrain. Officers barked orders, maintaining discipline, preventing the ranks from breaking into a disorganized rush. They rounded a bend, and the valley of Gerald opened before them. What they saw defied comprehension. The valley floor was carpeted with bodies, thousands upon thousands, equipment scattered everywhere. Tents collapsed, campfires burned down to ash, weapons lying unused beside those who would never wield them again. It was the aftermath of a battle, but it had not been Judah's battle. The Judean forces spread out cautiously, moving through the scene, trying to understand what had happened. The evidence told a story. fragmentary, but clear enough. The coalition had made camp here, confident, preparing for the final push toward Jerusalem. Then something had gone wrong, terribly, catastrophically wrong. Perhaps it started with a misunderstanding in the dark. Different languages, different tribal markings. The Moabites, Ammonites, and peoples from Mount S were allies of convenience, not unified by language or culture, bound together by a common enemy, but lacking the deep trust that comes from long alliance. In the darkness, perhaps a Moabitette patrol encountered Ammonite sentries. Neither side recognized the other immediately. Someone panicked. A weapon was drawn. Blood was shed. The fighting spread. Units here in combat in the night assumed they were under attack. They grabbed weapons, rallied to defend their section of camp, and in the confusion, they attacked whoever was nearest. Once started, the violence became self-perpetuating. Old grudges surfaced. Ancient rivalries between tribes that had been temporarily suppressed for the campaign now erupted. The unified coalition dissolved into chaos, each group fighting for survival against everyone else. By morning, the army that had seemed invincible had destroyed itself. Some Judean soldiers simply stood, staring, unable to process the scene. Others wept, overwhelmed by relief and awe. This was the deliverance they had been promised. This was the battle they did not have to fight. Jehoshaphat walked through the valley, his personal guards surrounding him, surveying the destruction. He paused occasionally, looking at abandoned banners, at siege equipment that would never be used, at supply wagons full of provisions that had been meant to sustain an occupation of Judah. "The battle is not yours, but God's," the king whispered, repeating Jaziel's prophetic word. "You will not have to fight this battle." It had been literal truth, not metaphor, not spiritual encouragement, actual physical reality. They had not fought. They had marched, singing, and arrived to find their enemies already defeated by forces beyond human comprehension or control. The commanders began organizing collection teams. The prophetic word had said they would see deliverance. It had not mentioned what would come after, but ancient customs of warfare were clear. The victor claimed the spoils, and spread across this valley were the supplies, weapons, equipment, and valuables of 3 armies. "Gather everything Jehoshaphat ordered, clothes, equipment, valuables, all of it. But take nothing that is forbidden, no idols, no objects of pagan worship. We will take what can be sanctified and used, and we will destroy the rest." The collection began. It would take days. Wood. The amount of material was staggering. Armor and weapons, yes, but also gold and silver, precious stones, fine fabrics. The coalition armies had been confident enough to bring their wealth with them, perhaps anticipating a long occupation, perhaps planning to use it to hire additional mercenaries after Judah fell. Now it would go to Judah instead, not as conquest taken through violence, but as provision given through divine intervention. The soldiers worked systematically, gathering materials, sorting, organizing. The mood was subdued despite the magnitude of the victory. There was joy, yes, but also a kind of sacred awe. They were walking through a demonstration of power that made human military might seem trivial by comparison. As the first day of collection ended and the Judean forces made camp in the valley, Jehoshaphat called his commanders together. "Tomorrow we continue the collection. It will take at least 3 days, perhaps 4. When we're finished, we return to Jerusalem, but we do not return as conquering warriors. We return as witnesses. What happened here will be told to our children and our children's children. This valley will be remembered." One of the commanders spoke up. "My lord, what should we call this place? It needs a name that captures what happened here." Jehoshaphat looked around the valley at the camps of his people, at the evidence of destruction that had not come by their hand, at the lavish provision that had come from the enemy's own supplies. "We will call it the Valley of Berika," he said quietly, "the Valley of Blessing." 'Cause that was what it was. Not a battlefield in the traditional sense, a place where curse had been transformed into blessing, where intended destruction had become unexpected provision, where human impossibility had encountered divine faithfulness and found that faith was stronger than fear, stronger than armies, stronger than any coalition of human power. The Valley of Blessing. The name would stick, lasting for centuries, a permanent memorial to the day when worship won a battle that swords could never have won. The Valley of Blessing. For 3 full days, Judah remained in the valley. The collection of spoils continued from sunrise to sunset, requiring careful organization to manage the enormous quantity of materials. The armor alone represented wealth beyond calculation. Bronze helmets, chest plates, chignoirs, shields, all sized for warriors. But the metal could be melted down and reforged for Judah's own forces or sold to traders. The weapons were of exceptional quality. The coalition had clearly spared no expense in equipping their troops, confident that superior numbers and better equipment would guarantee victory. Then there were the supplies: grain, oil, wine, dried meat. Enough to feed Judah's entire army for months. Tents, cooking equipment, water containers, everything needed to sustain a military campaign. Medical supplies, tools, rope, pack animals, donkeys, and camels wandering loose through the valley now rounded up and claimed. But the most stunning discoveries were the valuables: gold and silver in astonishing quantities, precious stones, fine clothing, musical instruments. Apparently, some of the coalition forces had brought their family wealth with them, either because they expected to be gone for an extended period or because they planned to settle in Judah after conquering it. The Levites oversaw the collection, ensuring that forbidden items were identified and destroyed rather than taken. Idols, ritual objects associated with pagan worship, anything that might bring spiritual corruption into Judah. These were gathered separately and burned. The soldiers worked with an interesting mixture of efficiency and reverence. And this was not looting in the traditional sense. This was harvesting a field they had not planted, gathering fruit from trees they had not cultivated. They worked diligently, but without the frenzy or greed that often accompanied battlefield plunder. Each evening as the sun set, the camp gathered for worship. The Levites led, but increasingly everyone participated. They sang the same songs they had sung on the march, but now with different emotional resonance. Then it had been faith without evidence. Now it was thanksgiving based on witnessed reality. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. The words carried across the valley a counterpoint to the silence of death that had defined this place before. Where confusion and violence had reigned, now there was order and peace. Where enemies had destroyed themselves, now allies worked together, building community, even in the process of collecting the remains of war. Jehoshaphat spent time each day walking through the site, often alone except for a single guard. He studied the scene, fixing it in his memory. He understood that he had witnessed something few kings ever saw, a clear, unmistakable demonstration that divine power was real and could act decisively in human affairs. This was not a battle won through superior tactics or a fortuitous alliance or even exceptional courage by his troops. This was intervention, pure and simple. Judah had shown up and watched God fight their battle for them. On the third evening, the king called a special assembly. The entire camp gathered, and he stood before them, his voice carrying in the still air. "We came to this valley expecting to fight," he began. "We came prepared to die if necessary. We came trusting a promise that seemed impossible, and we found that faith in God's word is never misplaced." He paused, looking around at the faces in the crowd. Soldiers who had feared they would never see their families again. Young men who had been prepared to give their lives in defense of their nation. Old veterans who had seen battle before and knew how rarely conflicts ended with zero friendly casualties. Tomorrow we begin the journey home. We will return to Jerusalem carrying more than we could have imagined. But the true treasure is not the gold or silver. It is the knowledge that the God we serve is faithful, that when we do not know what to do, but our eyes are on him, he acts. The crowd murmured agreement. Then someone began to sing, and others joined in. And soon the entire assembly was engaged in spontaneous worship, not because it was scheduled or required, but because the only appropriate response to what they had experienced was gratitude. That night, lying in his tent, Jehoshaphat thought about the political implications. Word would spread. Other nations would hear what happened. How would they respond? With fear, certainly, with caution. Small kingdoms survive by being either powerful enough to deter attack or too insignificant to be worth conquering. Judah had just demonstrated a third option. Protection that came not from military strength or political irrelevance, but from divine favor. The surrounding nations would think twice before attacking, not because they feared Judah's army, but because they would wonder if Judah's God would fight on their behalf again. Chapter 9. Peace restored. The return to Jerusalem was unlike any military homecoming in memory. Usually armies returned either in grim silence after defeat or in boisterous celebration after hard-won victory. This was neither. The column moved slowly, burdened with the enormous quantity of spoils, pack animals, carts, soldiers carrying bundles. Behind them, the Valley of Blessing already becoming a landmark, a place that would be pointed out to travelers for generations. As they approached Jerusalem, lookouts spotted them and raced ahead to spread the news. The army was returning, and they were intact. No evidence of casualties and loaded with plunder. The city gates opened, and the people poured out to meet them. The scene was chaotic with joy. Families reunited. Children ran to their fathers. Wives embraced husbands they had feared they would never see again. But beneath the celebration was something deeper. As the story spread, told by soldiers to their families, shared in the streets, repeated in the markets, the people began to understand what had actually happened. This was not a normal military victory. This was not even an extraordinary military victory. This was something else entirely. God had fought for them literally, physically, decisively, while they watched. The procession continued through the city streets toward the temple. Jehoshaphat led, but the focus was not on the king. This was not a royal triumph. This was a national thanksgiving. At the temple, the priests were ready. The king had sent word ahead, and preparations had been made for proper sacrifices of thanksgiving. The altars burned continuously for days as the nation brought offerings, not as obligation, but as overflow of gratitude. Jehoshaphat stood before the people again, this time in the temple courts where just days before, he had confessed their helplessness. "We asked the Lord what to do," he said. "We confessed we had no power to face the vast army attacking us. We admitted we did not know what to do, but our eyes were on him." The crowd listened, many of them having been present for that original prayer, and he answered not with a complex strategy, not with a demand for greater faith. He answered with a simple command: "Do not be afraid. The battle is not yours. You will not have to fight. Go out tomorrow and see what I will do." Jehoshaphat's voice grew stronger. "We obeyed. We went out. We took the singers with us, worshiping our way toward what should have been our destruction. And we found our enemies had destroyed themselves. We collected spoils for 3 days. We renamed the Valley Blessing because that is what it became." He paused. Then his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But in the silence of the crowd's attention, everyone heard, "Remember this. When fear comes, when circumstances overwhelm, when the odds are impossible, remember that the battle is not ours. Remember that our God fights for those who trust him." The days that followed were unlike anything Jerusalem had experienced. It was celebration, yes, but also deep national reflection. The event had been too dramatic, too clear to be brushed aside or explained away. Even the most skeptical, those who tended toward practical politics and military realism, could not deny what had happened, and the impact rippled outward. Traders carried the story to other cities. Travelers heard it and shared it in distant regions. The news spread across the ancient Near East. Judah's enemies had destroyed themselves. Judah's God had fought their battle for them. The response from surrounding nations was immediate and dramatic. Kings who had been considering military action against Judah reconsidered. Tribute that had been slow in coming arrived promptly. Alliances that had been conditional became more concrete. The text from that period is direct. The fear of God came on all the surrounding kingdoms when they heard how the Lord had fought against the enemies of Israel. And the kingdom of Jehoshaphat was at peace, for his God had given him rest on every side. Peace, not negotiated through treaties or maintained through military deterrence. Peace that came because potential adversaries decided that attacking Judah was simply too dangerous. Not because of Judah's strength, but because of their God's demonstrated willingness to intervene. For years afterward, Judah experienced stability. Trade flourished. The population grew. The reforms Jehoshaphat had instituted took deeper root. The teaching of the law continued. Justice was administered fairly. The temple remained the center of national life. But what persisted most strongly was the memory. Parents told their children. Teachers incorporated the story into instruction. Singers composed songs about it. The Valley of Blessing became a pilgrimage site, a place where people would go to remember, to give thanks, to strengthen their own faith by standing where the impossible had happened. Because that was ultimately what the story was about. Not military strategy, not political maneuvering, not human cleverness or strength. It was about what happened when a nation faced impossible odds, confessed their helplessness, trusted a promise that seemed absurd, and discovered that faith was not weakness, but the doorway to power beyond human comprehension. Epilogue: Victory through trust. Years later, long after the events at the Valley of Blessing, an elderly Jehoshaphat would reflect on his reign. He had faced many challenges. He had made mistakes, as all leaders do. He had navigated complex political situations, managed internal conflicts, dealt with the endless complications of governing a small nation surrounded by larger powers. But when asked about the defining moment of his kingship, he always returned to that valley, to the day when singing replaced strategy, when worship won a battle that weapons never could have. The lesson was not that military strength was irrelevant. Judah maintained its army, kept its fortifications, continued to train soldiers. But the people never forgot that their ultimate security came not from chariots or cavalry, but from covenant relationship with a God who was faithful to his promises. That knowledge changed how they faced subsequent challenges, not with false confidence or presumption, but with a deep-rooted trust that when they did what they could and then looked to God for the rest, he would be faithful. The story spread far beyond Judah's borders. It became part of the cultural memory, not just of one nation, but of many. Centuries later, people who had never heard of Jehoshaphat, who could not have pointed to the Valley of Blessing on a map, still told stories about the time an army was defeated by singing, because it touched something universal in human experience. The feeling of being overwhelmed, of facing odds that seem insurmountable, of reaching the end of your own strength and resources and having nowhere else to turn. In those moments, the story of Jehoshaphat whispered a possibility. Maybe the battle is not yours. Maybe your inadequacy is not the end of the story. Maybe there is power available to those who are willing to admit their weakness and trust something greater than themselves. Not every crisis ends like the Valley of Blessing. Not every prayer receives such a dramatic answer. The world is complex, and faith does not eliminate suffering or guarantee earthly success. But the story remains preserved across millennia because it witnessed a truth that remains true. When fear surrounds us, trust can become our greatest defense. When we face enemies too strong for us to defeat, worship can be an act of warfare. When we do not know what to do, fixing our eyes on divine faithfulness is not naive optimism, but profound wisdom. The coalition army approached the Valley of Gerald with overwhelming force, confident in their numbers, certain of victory. They had planned for every military contingency. They had brought sufficient supplies. They had coordinated between multiple nations. What they had not planned for was the possibility that their target was protected by something beyond military calculation, that Judah's confession of weakness would become a doorway to strength, that songs of praise would prove more powerful than swords. The sun sets now over what was once called the Valley of Blessing. The ancient battles are long finished. The kingdoms that fought them have crumbled into dust. The soldiers who witnessed the impossible have been gone for centuries. But the lesson remains, passed down through generations, preserved in text and memory, and the lived experience of countless individuals who have faced their own impossible battles. Sometimes the greatest victories come not through fighting, but through faith. Not through strength, but through surrender. Not through knowing what to do, but through admitting you do not know and turning your eyes toward the one who does. The battle is not always yours. Sometimes you're called simply to take your position, stand firm, worship, and watch what God will do. And when fear surrounds you, when the odds are overwhelming, when you have exhausted your own resources and strategies, remember a small nation that faced a vast army was singing. Remember a king who confessed helplessness and found power. Remember a valley where intended destruction became unexpected blessing. Remember that trust can be a weapon more powerful than any forged from bronze or iron. That faith is not weakness, but the doorway to strength beyond human comprehension. Remember and take courage. The battle may not be yours at all,